The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of the Riverside County Courthouse as Harold McKenzie shuffled through the metal detectors, his weathered hands gripping a manila folder containing documents for his property dispute hearing. At 78 years old, his frame had grown thin and his steps deliberate, but around his neck hung two simple pieces of stamped metal on a chain that had never left his chest in over 50 years. The dog tags bore the faded impressions of his name, serial number, and blood type, worn smooth by decades of wear against his heart. The courthouse lobby buzzed with the usual mix of lawyers in expensive suits, clerks rushing between floors, and citizens waiting for their cases to be called. Harold found a seat on one of the wooden benches, pulling his worn cardigan closer around his shoulders. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, institutional glow that made the marble floors seem cold and unwelcoming. As Harold sat quietly reviewing his paperwork, a group of younger people waiting for their own hearings began to notice him. A woman in her 30s with perfectly manicured nails nudged her companion, a man in designer jeans who was scrolling through his phone. "Look at that old guy," she whispered loudly enough for others to hear. "Is he seriously wearing dog tags like some kind of wannabe soldier boy?" Her companion looked up from his screen and snorted. "Probably bought those at a thrift store. Old guys love playing dress-up with military stuff they never earned." Their conversation attracted the attention of others in the waiting area. A businessman in a three-piece suit adjusted his gold watch and shook his head dismissively. "Pathetic, really. You see these old-timers all the time, trying to get respect they never deserved. Those tags probably came from a costume shop." Harold heard every word but kept his eyes focused on his documents, his weathered fingers unconsciously touching the metal tags through his cardigan. The chain felt heavier today, as it always did when people questioned what it represented. He had learned long ago that defending himself only invited more ridicule, so he remained silent, his dignity intact despite the cruel whispers growing louder around him. A court clerk with a clipboard called out several names for preliminary hearings, and the crowd began to shift and move. As people passed Harold's bench, more comments followed. A young man with expensive sneakers laughed to his girlfriend, "Check out Grandpa's bling. Bet he tells everyone he was a war hero while he stocks groceries." Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Your comment helps our community grow stronger. Thanks, and let's get back to the story. The mockery continued as Harold was eventually called for his hearing and made his way slowly toward Courtroom C. Judge Patricia Williams presided over the civil matters docket that morning. Her black robes a stark contrast to her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She had seen thousands of cases over her 20-year career on the bench, and at first glance, Harold appeared to be just another elderly plaintiff in a minor property dispute. What the courtroom audience did not know, what even Judge Williams had yet to discover, was that Harold McKenzie carried with him a story that would humble every person who had dared to mock his simple metal tags. Those tags had been issued to him in 1968 when he was 19 years old and preparing to deploy to Vietnam with the 173rd Airborne Brigade. They had been with him through 13 months of combat operations in the jungles of Southeast Asia, through firefights that claimed the lives of his closest friends, and through acts of heroism that would later earn him decorations most people had never heard of. But Harold never spoke of these things. The young man who had charged enemy positions to save wounded comrades, who had called in artillery strikes on his own position to prevent enemy overrun, who had carried 3 injured soldiers to safety during the Battle of Dak II, had returned home to a country that did not want to hear his stories. So he had learned to keep them to himself, working quietly as a maintenance supervisor at the local high school for 35 years, raising his children, and wearing his dog tags as a private reminder of the brothers he had left behind in a distant jungle. As Harold entered the courtroom, several people from the lobby had followed to watch the proceedings, their entertainment seemingly unfinished. The woman with the manicured nails took a seat in the gallery and continued her commentary in stage whispers. "I bet the judge throws him out when she sees he is trying to play the fake veteran card." Her companion was already recording with his phone, hoping to capture what he assumed would be an embarrassing moment for the old man. "This is going to be hilarious. Wait until he tries to tell everyone he is some kind of war hero." Judge Williams called the court to order and began reviewing the case file. Harold versus the Riverside Property Management Company, a dispute over maintenance fees charged to his modest apartment. As she read through the preliminary documents, her attention was caught by a presence in the back of the courtroom that made her pause. A man in military dress uniform had entered quietly and taken a seat in the last row, his chest adorned with ribbons and his shoulders bearing the 4 silver stars of a full general. General Robert Chin had not planned to be in this courtroom today. The 62-year-old career soldier was visiting the courthouse on entirely different business, a consultation regarding a veteran advocacy program he was helping to establish. But as he passed by Courtroom C, something had caught his eye through the small window in the door. An elderly man in a cardigan, standing with the posture that only came from military training, wearing something around his neck that glinted in the harsh courtroom lighting. General Chun had entered the courtroom and taken his seat just as Harold was being sworn in. From his position in the back row, the general had a clear view of the old man's profile, and more importantly, of the dog tags that hung visible outside his cardigan. Even from a distance, General Chun could make out enough detail to recognize something that made his breath catch in his throat. Those were not ordinary dog tags. The general had seen enough military identification in his 4 decades of service to spot the subtle differences that marked Harold's tags as authentic Vietnam-era issue. But it was more than their authenticity that caught the general's attention. There was something about the way Harold carried himself, the unconscious military bearing that never fully left a combat veteran, that spoke of experiences far beyond what the mocking crowd could imagine. As Harold began to present his case about the disputed maintenance fees, his voice was steady but soft, requiring Judge Williams to ask him to speak up. The gallery continued their whispered commentary, emboldened by what they perceived as the old man's nervousness. He is probably making up some sob story about being a poor veteran, the businessman in the expensive suit murmured to his neighbor. General Chun felt his jaw tighten as he listened to the disrespectful murmurs from the gallery. He had dedicated his life to serving alongside men like Harold, and he recognized in the elderly plaintiff the quiet dignity that marked those who had seen real combat. The general's trained eye noticed details that escaped the civilian crowd, the way Harold stood at attention without thinking it, the precise way he organized his documents, and most telling of all, the unconscious way his hand would move to touch his dog tags when he felt stressed. Judge Williams was growing increasingly annoyed with the disruptions from the gallery. She had noticed the whispered comments and the young man with his phone, and her patience was wearing thin. However, her attention was also drawn to the military officer in the back of her courtroom. It was unusual to have such high-ranking military personnel present for a routine civil hearing, and she wondered if there was some connection she was missing. As Harold continued his testimony about the property management company's unreasonable fees, General Chin made a decision that would change the entire atmosphere of the courtroom. He rose from his seat with the fluid motion of a career soldier and began walking down the center aisle toward the front of the courtroom. Every eye in the room turned to watch the imposing figure in dress blues, his 4 stars catching the light as he moved with unmistakable authority. The whispers from the gallery died immediately as the crowd realized they were in the presence of one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Army. General Chin's face was stern, his eyes focused not on the judge or the proceedings, but on Harold Mackenzie and the dog tags that had drawn him into this courtroom in the first place. Judge Williams looked up from her notes, startled by the unexpected approach of the general. "General, this is highly irregular. Do you have business before this court?" General Chun came to attention before the bench, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades of military leadership. "Your Honor, I request permission to approach the bench. I believe this court and everyone present needs to understand exactly who they are dealing with today." The courtroom fell into complete silence. Harold looked up in confusion, not understanding why a general would be interested in his simple property dispute. The mocking crowd in the gallery suddenly felt very uncomfortable, sensing that something significant was happening that they did not comprehend. Judge Williams studied the general's face and saw something there that made her nod slowly. "Permission granted, General. Please approach." General Chin walked to within a few feet of where Harold stood at the plaintiff's table. For the first time, he could clearly see the dog tags that hung around the old man's neck, and what he read there confirmed everything he had suspected. The serial number, the dates, and most importantly, the unit designation told a story that made the general's chest tighten with emotion. Harold Mackenzie had served with the 173rd Airborne Brigade during some of the most intense fighting of the Vietnam War. General Chin knew the history of that unit, knew the battles they had fought and the sacrifices they had made. But as he looked more closely at Harold's tags, he saw something else that made him catch his breath. A small additional marking that indicated Harold had been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for valor in combat. "Your Honor," General Chun said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom, "I need this court to understand that the man standing before you is not just any veteran. These dog tags that some in your gallery have seen fit to mock represent service with the 173rd Airborne Brigade in Vietnam. This man fought in some of the most savage battles of that war, including the Battle of Dak, to where his unit faced overwhelming odds and still held their ground." Harold's face flushed with embarrassment. He had never wanted this kind of attention, had never sought recognition for his service. But General Chin was not finished. "The marking on these tags indicates that Sergeant Mackenzie was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism in action against an armed enemy. Your Honor, there are fewer than 40,000 of these decorations that have ever been awarded in the entire history of our nation. The man standing before you charged into enemy fire to save the lives of his wounded comrades, calling in artillery strikes on his own position to prevent enemy forces from overrunning his unit's defensive perimeter." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Judge Williams felt her face flush as she realized the magnitude of disrespect that had been shown in her courtroom. She looked out at the gallery where the mocking crowd now sat in stunned silence, their earlier comments hanging in the air like accusations against their own character. General Chun turned to face the gallery, his 4 stars gleaming as he addressed the people who had found Harold's service so amusing. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "you have spent this morning mocking a man who has demonstrated more courage in a single day than most people show in a lifetime. While you were questioning the authenticity of his service, you were sitting in the presence of a genuine American hero." The woman with the manicured nails felt tears forming in her eyes as the weight of her cruelty became clear. The young man with the expensive sneakers had already put away his phone, his face burning with shame. The businessman in the 3-piece suit stared at his hands, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Judge Williams rose from her bench, something she rarely did during routine proceedings. The sight of both the judge and the 4-star general standing simultaneously created a moment of such gravity that everyone in the courtroom felt its weight. "Mr. Mackenzie," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "I want to personally apologize for the disrespect shown in my courtroom today. Your service and sacrifice deserve nothing but honor and gratitude." Harold stood quietly, overwhelmed by the sudden attention and recognition. For 50 years, he had carried his memories in silence, never seeking recognition or thanks. The dog tags had been his private connection to the brothers he had served with, many of whom had not made it home. Now, in this sterile courtroom where he had come simply to dispute an unfair bill, his service was being honored by some of the highest authorities in military and civilian life. General Chin approached Harold and extended his hand. "Sergeant Mackenzie, it is an honor to meet you. Your service with the 173rd Airborne is legendary in military circles. The courage you showed at Dak to save countless lives and upheld the finest traditions of the United States Army." Harold shook the general's hand, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, sir. I was just doing my job, same as everyone else over there." The general smiled, recognizing the humility that marked true heroes. "That is exactly what every recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross says, Sergeant. It is never just a job when you put your life on the line to save others." Judge Williams had tears in her eyes as she watched the exchange. In 20 years on the bench, she had never experienced a moment quite like this. The transformation of her courtroom from a place of mockery to one of honor and respect was complete, and she knew that everyone present would carry this moment with them for the rest of their lives. The property dispute that had brought Harold to court that morning was resolved quickly and decisively. Judge Williams ruled in his favor on every point, noting for the record that the court held veterans in the highest regard and would not tolerate any company taking advantage of those who had served their country. The property management company's representative, who had planned to fight every charge, immediately agreed to waive all disputed fees and issued a formal apology. As the hearing concluded, something remarkable happened. One by one, the people in the gallery who had mocked Harold earlier approached him to apologize. The woman with the manicured nails had tears streaming down her face as she told him how sorry she was for her cruel words. The young man who had planned to record Harold's supposed humiliation instead asked if he could shake the hand of a genuine war hero. General Chun remained in the courtroom until everyone had left, ensuring that Harold was treated with the respect he deserved. As they walked together toward the courthouse exit, the general shared stories of other veterans he had known who carried their service quietly, never seeking recognition for their extraordinary deeds. The day had begun with Harold Mackenzie facing mockery and disrespect for wearing the dog tags that connected him to his service and his fallen brothers. It ended with a courtroom full of people who had learned the true meaning of honor and sacrifice. The simple metal tags that had been dismissed as costume jewelry were revealed to be symbols of the highest courage and dedication to duty. As Harold left the courthouse that afternoon, his dog tags caught the sunlight streaming through the windows. They looked no different than they had that morning, still worn and faded from decades of wear. But everyone who had witnessed the events in Courtroom scene now understood that those simple CES of metal represented something far more valuable than gold. The courage of a young soldier who had faced the ultimate test and emerged as a hero, carrying his honor quietly for 50 years until the moment when justice and recognition finally found him.